along. So I just love to welcome all of you. I'm Denise Canfield, and I'll be emceeing this event, for lack of a better word. And we just want you to know that this is our Business Agility Learning Series. And the learning series are actually online events that are leading up to the Business Agility Global Conference. And the conference will truly be global, running from March 22nd to March 25th, from Asia all the way to the Americas over 4 days. And there will be speakers and thought leaders throughout those days telling their stories, with opportunities to learn and discuss, to think, and to network. Tickets are really priced affordably. I believe they're $45. And what's great about this event is all the proceeds go to Doctors Without Borders. Other people will try the French pronunciation or other pronunciation. I'll just go with Doctors Without Borders. And so I hope you're all able to attend that conference. I'll remind you that this particular event learning session is being recorded, and in compliance with GDPR rules, your consent is assumed when you remain on the call. All attendees are placed on mute by default. Please know that you can unmute yourself. The moderator may also unmute you, and that we look for you to use the chat box to raise any questions that you have or to share with us. And so without any further ado, I'm super excited to introduce Mathias Eifert as our facilitator today. Mathias is the Managing Consultant and Technical Fellow at Excella. And what I truly loved as I was getting to know Mathias was his headline on LinkedIn says he is a sense maker, which is really what he's going to help us understand today. He has been an Agile coach, a Scrum Master, a solution architect, an analyst, and just has a wealth of experience in a variety of industries, helping and coaching clients and guiding organizations. And so I want to thank you, Mathias, for being with us today and sharing this information. And I'll turn it over to you to get us started.
All right, great. Thank you so much. I am sharing my screen. I hope you can all see that.
You are.
Okay, fantastic. Hello, welcome everyone to this learning session. Thank you for the introduction, Denise. My name is Mathias Eifert, and I'm very happy to see all of you here today. Thank you for spending your lunch or evening with us, whatever it might be. You are here, so it would seem that there isn't that much of a further need to try to impress you with my credentials at this point, but just to give you some very quick context, I'm a coach and delivery lead at Excella. We are an agile technology and consulting company headquartered in the DC area. And if you've been at any agile conferences or coach camps, at least in North America in the last few years, chances are that you could have attended a session by one of our coaches or scrum masters. I am lucky that I get to work with a lot of really awesome people, and we tend to be heavily involved in the agile community. So yeah, I personally have been at this for about 20 years or so, and starting with hardcore kind of quantitative lean quality stuff, getting into software, then agile, and for a few years now, pulling all of that together through the lens of complexity in Kinematic. On the screen, on the slide, there's also my contact info. Feel free to find me on LinkedIn or connect by email or Twitter if you would like to continue the conversation after today. So just one thing before we get started. I hope you all noticed that the subtitle of the session says why agility allows us to thrive in an unpredictable world, not how. We are going to get into the hows to some degree, but I do want to set expectations that there will also be a good amount of conceptual things that I'm going to walk through. Because that is actually, in my observation, maybe a bit part of the problem that the Agile community is increasingly running into, right? Where we're not seeing the results we're being told to expect, and people are questioning why Agile and Agility. And to me, I approach it as Agile itself is a mental model, right? The famous mindset. It's thinking about the way we do things, not just how to do the things. But between all the corporate pressures to get there quickly and the daily overload and the frameworks everybody wants to sell us, we get so caught up in the doing that there's often not that much time to reflect. And so as a community of practice, I feel like despite our best efforts, we've maybe maneuvered ourselves a little bit into a corner where we're sort of permanently stuck at executing the same things over and over, kind of Like we're sort of at the shoe level for those of you who are familiar with the Shuhari model. And it's really easy to just get caught up in just implementing all the things and demonstrating results while we're also sort of constantly, arguing a little bit against inertia and constraints and pushback. So I would invite you to look at the next 85 minutes or so as perhaps an opportunity to take a step back, connect some dots, and do some sense making together by going back to starting with the why, to steal that very famous slogan, right? Right, I would really be interested in learning a bit more about you all, what your context is. So we have a quick poll for you. Matt, if you could pull up poll 1, please, and if everybody would quickly check the appropriate boxes, then we can all see who is here today. Don't overthink it. We're just trying to get a rough idea of kind of where you're coming from. Seeing a few responses. All right, trickling in. All right, we'll give it a few more seconds. We're at 19 out of 26. We'll see. Okay, going at 21. Fantastic. Thank you. All right, that's probably good enough. Okay, great. Now we can share the results. Great. So this is actually an interesting distribution. We do have people from IT, just barely the majority, but we also have a lot of business non-IT and number of other domains. Exposure to Kinevin. Few people applying it in their work. That's great. The rest of them are more sort of at the starting point. So we will do a walkthrough of all of that. And lots of familiarity with agility. That's great. Some people are, a little bit more at the beginning. Fantastic. Good. Thank you for that. That gives me a little bit of a starting point. Okay, then we can close that for now. Thank you. And I just sort of mentioned the. Let me see if I can get that right. Okay, I just need to get back to my slides. I can actually advance this. Right. I just mentioned these sort of constant battles that we find ourselves in, right? And the Kinevin folks have a concept that they call bounded applicability, which really just means that all these methods and tools that we have in our toolbox, but frankly, all the ones that our maybe less agile inclined partners on this journey have in theirs, they all have value, but only in the right context. And what I really, really like about Kinevin, where I think it's been very helpful for me, is that it helps us identify, differentiate, and then even talk about these concepts, these contexts. Sorry, because the words that we use can make a big difference, right? And Kinevin, from what I've found so far, provides a far more nuanced and systematic framework to do that than most of the other mental models that I've come across. So I hope that's going to be interesting for you. And by the way, I will be using Agile and Agility mostly interchangeably. I'm aware that there are, of course, differences between Agile and business agility, but today is mostly sort of about the higher level aspects and goals, and those I think are pretty similar. Okay, let's start with a quick walkthrough of the Kinevin framework because it's really the basis for all the rest. Now, one quick disclaimer, I will walk you through a sort of basic version. There are additional things like the liminal aspects that we will not get into today because that would be way more than we really need, and it would take up all the time. Also, Kinevin uses a lot of kind of difficult words, things like exaptive or aporetic. And while I do appreciate the exactness and nuance in that language, it also creates a little bit barriers to understanding. So I'm going to tone that down a bit. And while a few things might get lost, to me, the value of exposing more people to the overall ideas kind of outweighs that. So if anyone here is a true Kinevin expert, please keep that in mind and be tolerant of my simplifications. The idea is to focus on the big picture. Fortunately, the one Kinevin expert who I know is here on the call today is my colleague, Trent Hone, and we do a lot of friendly arguing all the time, so I feel pretty safe there. Okay, let's do a quick walkthrough. Kinevin was conceived as a sense-making framework by Dave Snowden in 1999. So it actually precedes the Agile Manifesto by a couple of years. And it describes 4 problem domains. Okay, so there's actually a 5th domain, that thing in the middle, but we'll get to that a little bit later. The first one is a nice, stable corner of the universe where things are relatively simple. It used to be called obvious, now it's called clear. I still have both of them on there. Once we define what we want to achieve, is that clear best way of getting there. And we can do that same thing over and over again, right? Think making fries at your favorite fast food joint. This is the realm of best practices and standard operating procedures. Same inputs, same outputs. So you could also refer to this as a context of known knowns. Sometimes, though, we have several good options, and it requires some analysis and maybe expert knowledge to really figure out what'll work and how. This is the complicated domain, the realm of good practices defined by the experts. Most engineering and science problems fall sort of into this category. Business rules, maybe, certain design patterns. We have reliable cause and effect relationships, even though it may take us a little while to figure them out, and there may be significant trade-offs that we're going to have to evaluate. But we understand what parts of the solution are missing, so you could say there are known unknowns. Both of these domains, complicated and clear, describe what Snowden calls ordered systems. Often, though, we run into problems with a large number of inputs, some sort of open system where it's hard to define clear boundaries, and the way these inputs interact with each other is maybe not very well understood. We can only really see cause and effect after the fact, and even if we think we're doing everything exactly the same way for a second time, or even for the 100th time, things actually may turn out differently. This is what Kinematic calls the complex domain. Almost anything dependent on human behavior falls into this domain, right? Markets, consumer patterns, policy, large projects, organizations. One issue here is that we can't fully grasp from the beginning what's most important for our desired outcomes, and often things will happen that we just did not anticipate. In the military, they use the term fog of war to describe this, right? We're dealing with unknown unknowns, the things we don't even know that we don't know them, much less whether they're important or not. And then the final domain here is called chaotic. We take all the messiness from complex, make it maybe even more random, and often add significant urgency and potentially high stakes. In other words, we have a dumpster fire. Now, that dumpster may be very, very large, or it may only be relevant to, say, your next production release. That depends on your context. Chaotic is not a permanent state. We either manage to stabilize things fairly quickly and move it to one of the other domains, or the dumpster will burn out and things crash. Now, while these domains help us make sense of what we're dealing with, the reality is that very rarely do problems fall neatly into just one of these buckets, right? Even for a clear issue, we often have humans involved who might behave somewhat unpredictably, maybe because some instruction, some step in our operating procedure is ambiguous to them when it was very clear to everyone else. And even very obviously complex problems usually have elements that are pretty obvious and clear-cut, or at least solvable with some good analysis. So for the rest of this session, we will mostly focus on the differences between the ordered and the complex domains, because that is for the most part where our daily reality tends to happen, and also where the biggest tensions exist. And one key difference is that over here on the right, in the ordered domains, we are navigating a mostly predictable environment. We have a reasonable expectation that we know what will happen if we do certain things, right? On the left, though, things are mostly unpredictable, and as we already said, doing the same thing twice or multiple times may actually have different outcomes, mostly because there are inputs or relationships that we don't have visibility into or just don't fully understand. So this left side is a much more difficult space to work in, right? And yet that's where most of our problems are located these days. Now, in some situations, we do have at least some control over where we place ourselves by choosing the scope of the problem that we want to address. I read a blog post some time ago with a great example case study, and I would love to give credit, but I haven't been able to find it again, so I feel a little bit bad about that. But it was a gentleman from England, I think, who described a project that started as a simple technology upgrade for a point of sale system. Known migration path, fairly obvious best way to do this. Then some executives said, well, we're already working on this. Let's think about how we can future-proof this platform. And now we have shifted to a complicated problem because there are multiple options of what we could do. And we need a bunch of analysis and maybe some experts. So the company called in support from consultants who started asking very open-ended questions to encourage innovation, because everybody wants innovation, right? And all of a sudden, we have crossed the line and made this a complex problem, because innovation by definition means newness and uncertainty, and there's ambiguity about what that even means. And at that point, some of the experienced IT operations folks started panicking, because this was a mission critical system. And if it failed, it had the potential to kill the company, right? I mean, because zero cash flow is usually a significant problem. And so they started actively resisting all of this scope expansion. And to some degree, the project had now devolved into chaos, because people were fighting over what was right and things went nowhere until someone made a decision and pulled it back, presumably. So we don't always get to pick, but when we do have options on how we frame a problem, then that can have a big impact, and it's important to be aware of that. Sometimes stability and simplicity, actually finishing things until we have resolved some critical issue, is actually far more important than planning for possible future innovation. And for many people, the complex domain at the same time makes some sort of intuitive sense. We get the notion, but it's also very sort of diffuse and hard to pin down, right? Which is actually very appropriate, since that is the hallmark of complex problems. But to unpack that a bit more, there's another concept that I'd like to introduce, and that is Vuca. It's a term that originated in the military, but it's pretty buzzy in the business world as well these days. So what does it actually mean? Well, it roughly translates into "it's messy out there." Vuca is an acronym, so let's go through these letters. V is volatility. How quickly do things change? Then we have uncertainty. How much don't we know, and how aware are we of that? Often this comes down to, how new is this thing, right? Complexity, this is a bit narrower than the Kinevin meaning where the complex domain covers all of Vuca. But in this context, complexity relates to how many inputs are there that can influence the outcomes we care about, and how well understood are the relationships between these inputs. Also, and this is an interesting one, are we dealing with what's sometimes referred to as a complex adaptive system, where our intervention or even just observing the system can actually change the behavior of the inputs, the agents in the system, or how they interact with each other? And then finally, ambiguity. People make assumptions about meaning all the time. And as we know, those are heavily influenced by our individual experiences and biases, right? Which, of course, are unique and different for every person. And then, of course, each one of these factors amplifies the other ones, right? More volatility, less time to clarify and flush out ambiguity. More complexity means more things we may not fully understand, and so we have more uncertainty. So let's do a quick poll, our second one, please. Who here thinks that Vuca has actually decreased in their life over the last decade or so? Put a couple of clicks in there. One so far, two. And of course, this is almost an unfair question at this point in time, right? I mean, all we have to say is COVID, and that's probably not made anybody's life a lot more easy. All right, yeah. The vast majority, basically way up. A few people in somewhat more stable contexts are like, yeah, somewhat more. All right, thank you. Um, you know, 2/3 are saying it's gone way up, and that makes sense, right? I mean, the thank you, Denise. The term VUCA itself, of course, implies that all of these aspects are trending more and more towards the high end of the spectrum, and as we just discussed, they mutually reinforce and amplify each other. And here's one more thought, actually. You can immediately see how scaling impacts pretty much every aspect of VUCA, right? So to summarize this a bit, with with complex problems or systems, we can have varying outcomes even if we try to repeat the exact same course of action, because cause and effect are not really visible and clear necessarily, partially because there's often a lot of stuff we just don't know and aren't even aware of, and partially maybe because we're dealing with nonlinear responses and what people sometimes call tipping points. And if we can make things sense of things at all, it's only in hindsight. And then we still shouldn't necessarily trust that that will even hold true on the next go around. So this is kind of tough, right? And it really points to one of the inconvenient truths we are faced with. Working through complexity is hard. It's time consuming. You have to revisit the same things over and over. It's draining because it's messy and you feel like you're just kind of poking around with any clear progress necessarily. And it's uncomfortable too for many people, right? Because the whole premise is that you don't know what the right answer is. We don't even know for sure what the right path forward is going to be, what we should be doing next. So most people kind of tend to want to get out of there fairly quickly. They don't like it. They don't have the mental bandwidth necessarily. They're just too busy for this stuff, right? And then this is, of course, where leadership comes in, because leaders going to lead, right? That's their job, their reason for existence. Heck, we often promote people exactly because they have the answers and they're decisive. So many leaders see it as their responsibility to lead us out of this unproductive wasteland and quickly get us back to action. And to some degree, that is appropriate. The complex domain can only be meaningfully explored through action, but we have to approach it the right way. Because decisiveness, just for expediencies or maybe exhaustion's sake, usually leads to something called premature convergence, right? Selecting a specific solution too quickly without considering other options. This is so true and so common that there's an entire family of memes just around this, right? You've probably heard about the hippo, right? The highest paid person's opinion. Just recently, I learned about the zebra. Actually, that was from Rahul, who's on the call today. Zebra is zero evidence, but really arrogant. And then there's perhaps my favorite, the Underpants Gnomes. This is from a South Park episode where the kids catch a bunch of gnomes stealing their underpants at South Park, right? And when they confront them why they would do this, it turns out it's all part of a business model. Phase one, collect underpants. Phase two, TBD. Phase three, profit. Now, this is kind of funny until you replace underpants with artificial intelligence, or for that matter, business agility. This is so much of an issue, this jumping to, the thing to do very quickly, that people have actually invented numerous process models and tools to help people stay with complex problems a little bit longer and be more systematic about exploring the options before they've had enough and someone pulls the escape hatch. And the way these things usually work is by providing scaffolding, right? Give us something that acts as a temporary structure so we can connect the dots better and feel like there's a bit more order and visible progress in the world. You could argue that design thinking, assumption mapping, impact mapping all fall into this category, and there's lots of others. Now, one key thing to keep in mind, though, is that what we're for the most part doing is we're not documenting established facts and known relationships, but instead we're making our assumptions visible so that we can then find ways to validate them. And the best of these tools actually do more than just help us keep the sense-making phase open a bit longer. They incorporate patterns that help us actually work better in this space. For one, they encourage wider and more systematic exploration, which can maybe help us find pockets of these unknowns so that we can potentially reduce the uncertainty a bit. Usually in these tools, we're creating shared visualizations to surface and maybe even resolve some of the ambiguity, the way different people see this issue. Capturing relevant elements and the interactions between them starts to address complexity a bit. So these tools can help us contain aspects of Vuca a little bit. Sometimes we can even dampen volatility just by kind of agreeing to put some stakes in the ground, right? And Cynefin itself can be looked at as sort of a meta pattern, a version of a scaffold, because it doesn't just help us categorize problems, it also provides some guidance on how to approach each domain. In the clear domain, the recommendation is sense, categorize, respond. In other words, look at the problem, determine which standard solution applies, and then execute that. Clear-cut rules make things like automation fairly straightforward, like maybe automated build pipelines. For complicated, that changes to sense, analyze, respond, which is really just a fancy way of saying examine the problem, analyze the solution options, maybe with a bit of back and forth trade-off analysis, and eventually implement one of the options. For complex problems, though, just looking at it won't tell us much because unpredictability, right? So here the approach changes to probe, sense, respond. In other words, we have to do something, preferably small and safe, observe what happens, good or bad, and then adjust and move forwards from there. Essentially, we run experiments, right? The thing is, they're not quite like our classic science experiments where we require repeatability to accept the results. Remember, in the complex space, doing the same thing twice, or what we think is the same thing, will not actually necessarily deliver the same outcome. So ideally, we want to actually try multiple things, maybe even at the same time, and then build on and amplify the ones that work. In chaotic situations, finally, we don't have time for gentle probing, and we can't build on the outcomes anyway because there are no rules and the house is on fire. So here we need to act, sense, respond, do the next thing that seems promising, see how that turns out, maybe try a few things, and hopefully stabilize things. Now, does the approach for the complex domain sound familiar? Well, it kind of should, right? Because probe, sense, respond describes an iterative learning loop, just like Scrum's inspect and adapt. In Scrum, essentially, each sprint output is a small probe, we get feedback, and then we adapt as necessary. And we have similar things in other Agile frameworks. So Agile is really a way to operate safely and as effectively as possible in the complex domain. And the same thing can be said for a whole bunch of related approaches, right? We're basically talking about iterative feedback and adaptation loops, going all the way back to the 40s to Deming's PDCA loop. And there's a reason why all these people landed on essentially the same pattern, right? Because it is the only way to increase your chances of success in the complex domain. I would actually argue that complexity and unpredictability are really the primary why for Agile. Now, don't get me wrong, Agile practices promote a lot of other great things too, especially around people and the way we work together. And those are really important. But in my view, you can respect your people and empower them and work at a sustainable pace and all these good things independent of Agile, right? And I mean, there's still plenty of Agile out there that struggles a lot with unrealistic demands and maybe somewhat suboptimal leadership. And I think a lot of these problems are really tied to Kynevin's fifth domain, the one that we haven't talked about yet. It's here in the middle, and it's called confusion, because it indicates the state of not knowing which problem context you're dealing with. Now, this may be because the decision maker just doesn't get it, or it could be that a decision has to be made by a group and people can't agree on what we're dealing with. And sometimes it's just not clear. Most problems don't fall neatly into just one domain, so it could be really hard to sort out. But I've also made the experience that often we have confusion because the decision makers don't seem to be sufficiently aware of the differences between these domains and their behavior and don't necessarily pay that much attention to it. And that brings us to why confusion is important. I mean, the sense-making process always starts there, so that's all good. But if people then don't actually explore this landscape to consider which kind of problem they need to engage with, they tend to just apply their default behavior, whatever they're most comfortable with. Some people think that more process solves everything, so they want to create detailed prescriptive procedures, no matter what. Know anybody like that? Probably. People with expert knowledge often default to assuming that extensive analysis will just always get you the best results, and then sometimes they get stuck in what we lovingly call analysis paralysis. And of course, there's the firefighting heroes who may actually be drawn to a state of sort of permanent chaos because that's where they get props and status for saving the day over and over again. So confusion about what we're dealing with often creates a pretty serious mismatch between problem and solution approach, and that usually does not end well. And I mean, let's be honest, right? Complex is almost nobody's default, especially not as a systematic approach. Good startup founders, yes. Jeff Bezos, I think so. Most of today's leaders, based on how they came up through the ranks, how they were trained in their MBA programs, not so much, right? The longer I do consulting, the more I'm observing that in most organizations, actually, the cultural defaults overwhelmingly favor either order or chaos. There isn't even necessarily an awareness that there is a complex domain with its own approach. And so we often even see agile implementations being kind of kind of pushed into one of those two, right? Usually, of course, towards order, because chaos is bad. And if you kind of grew up on the right side of this diagram, then you look at anything that doesn't have good plans and lots of predictions and all of that as being sort of chaotic. And so your goal actually is to impose more order on it and to pull it over into the complicated side of things. Because yeah, chaos is bad unless you're already in it and then you have to fix it. But order is the desired state, and creating more order, more process is necessary and encouraged. And I think we see that a lot in agile implementations. And to me, I think the biggest driver there is this desire for predictability, right? Wanting to operate on the right side, the discomfort with not having the answers. All right, it's time to get into our first breakout, where we are going to ask you to think a little bit about an example where your organization might have perhaps a somewhat unrealistic expectation of predictability, right? So we're going to give you a minute to just kind of think about that on your own, and then Matt is going to move everybody into a random breakout room. And you can kind of discuss your different examples, and things to think about maybe are, if you find an example, where might that come from? Are there constraints or incentives, or is it the culture, or just the knowledge, or maybe a lack of knowledge that kind of pushes that? And then, do the people who are affected by this have the authority to actually make changes? And if so, what form could that take? Is there anything you could do about it? All right, so we'll give you a minute to just kind of think for an example, and then Matt or Denise, if anybody, if one of you would push everybody into a breakout room, we're going to give you about 5 minutes or so in the breakout rooms. So thank you. I was in one of the breakout rooms, and we had a very good discussion. Thank you for that. I hope everybody else had some interesting examples and insights.
We still have a few more people, just so you know, coming back from breakouts. So.
Okay, we'll give it a moment.
Okay, take it away.
All right. So just need to get back to where I can forward my slides. Okay, we talked about this desire for predictability and how important that is. And the thing is, it makes sense, because predictability matters. It matters a lot, actually. So one aspect in which it matters is if we have it, then more planning and analysis will, up to a point, get us better outcomes. Again, most engineering problems work like that. But if we don't have predictability, we pretty quickly get significantly diminishing returns from doing more analysis, and our plans are less likely to hold up. Doesn't mean we shouldn't plan, but we shouldn't rely on the plans actually, staying valid for a really long time. My former coworker, Dane Weber, came up with a beautiful analogy that illustrates this gap very nicely. For those of you who are not from the US, this may not work quite as well. But if you imagine your classic manager type with an MBA or a PMP running a football team, right? A week before the game, the manager asks the team lead into a conference room and fires up the PowerPoint. So I'm going to need from you a plan for winning this football game. Based on market research, that means that we need you to deliver 30 to 36 points over the course of the game, right? We generously build in a margin of error for you because we totally understand there's always some variability. It's hard. But, we know the game is 4 quarters for a total of 60 minutes. So what I'm going to need from you is that you please provide a timeline for when you will score your points and which plays you will call to do so. We will also need a forecast of just exactly how many players of what kind you will need and when across the game in 1-minute increments. And as far as budget goes, we will pay each of these players the median for their position. And of course, any deviation from this plan is going to have to be approved by our change control board, right? This is, of course, same example for soccer. This is, of course, entirely absurd. We know that. And yet, for many large, complex efforts, this is a version of what leadership asks for, right? With a straight face. Well, as the famous Agile expert Taylor Swift once said, just because you make a good plan doesn't mean that's what's going to happen. So if we're saying that plans don't work so well in this unpredictable world, then what are we supposed to do? Well, the Agile community has some ideas about that. on the left side, we have the traditional iron triangle of project management, right? Which perhaps we should really have renamed a long time ago to the elastic triangle, because those hard constraints in most cases end up being surprisingly stretchy in the end, right? And the key idea here is that we start by defining everything that our customers want. We chisel that into stone tablets. We come up with a solution design and a plan to get there. And then we estimate just how much money and time that'll take. And this can work quite well, right? Bounded applicability, just as long as the scope isn't too big and we've done something similar plenty of times before. In other words, a clear or at most complicated problem. The Agile approach, on the other hand, basically says we tend to have much more certainty about how much money and time we have available. So let's constrain that and then build as much as we can in order of importance. And once we realize that we won't get everything done, which always happens, we can reprioritize and or decide whether it's worth investing additional funding. There's an approach that comes from the lean startup world called innovation accounting. And it basically says that I will give you just enough money to learn and show that you are producing something valuable. And that may not be financial ROI at this point. It usually isn't at the beginning. But if you can show that, we will give you additional funding. And the upside is that if we're not seeing the expected value, we can instead invest in something else that might give us more value. And that's a really good thing for the organization. But of course, it also doesn't work with annual budgets very well, right? So the next area of difference is how we as leaders organize the work. In traditional plan-driven approaches, we take a problem, this nice blob here on the left, and then we go ahead and design the entire solution up front, and then decompose that solution into small pieces of work, a work breakdown structure. Now that assumes what? Predictability, right? This entire approach is based on a massive assumption that we can predict everything that will need to be done. That, in Kinematic terms, this is overwhelmingly a complicated problem. But if it turns out that our problem, or maybe the best implementation path, is actually different from what we expected, this becomes very brittle very quickly. And with all that pressure for predictability and all the nice things that come with that, is that we see this bleed over into agile approaches a lot more often than we would like to see too, right? You just replace work breakdown structure with backlog of user stories, and voila, you are doing agile. No? I once worked with a client that had 3 years worth of user stories already in their backlog, already allocated to releases, of course, written by a separate business analyst group, just waiting for a contractor to execute on it. And the thing is, they were honestly dismayed when they realized that there was no actual agility to be found anywhere, because they thought they were following the process. So yeah, it is true that most problems or systems are not purely complex. We know that there are elements of multiple domains. So we have some clear things, some complicated elements, and a good number of complex aspects, this nice orange blob here. The problem is that with this approach, we basically sprinkle the complex, less predictable stuff across everything we do. And because we usually do this work in specialized silos for efficiency's sake, we have now boosted uncertainty and ambiguity and complexity because of all the dependencies, and the people doing the work have almost no context or ability to adapt because they only see a small piece of it. So we have actually increased Vuca overall and made things worse, potentially a lot worse. So the first problem here is that organizing work for efficiency can actually reduce predictability actively. What? That's a bummer. But we often try to increase efficiency through specialization, right? So people are organized into specialized groups where they are really focused on being the most productive doing some particular thing. And of course, these groups then rather quickly become fairly separated, what we often call functional silos. But these different functions and groups still all need to contribute to the final product for a customer, and so it ends up looking something like this, very simplified, of course. So then what happens? For starters, more functional separation creates more unknown unknowns. Right? For someone in another silo, this thing may be a known unknown, or even a known known. But over here on the left, not a clue that this is even important. And the more handoffs we have, the less alignment, and the more effort we have to expend on creating shared understanding and keeping that ambiguity under control. Also, if this process is just about adding widgets to a thing like a car production line where we can forecast and optimize down to the second how long stuff takes, this can work, and some companies do this really, really well. But in knowledge work, even individual tasks tend to have much more variance, and so the dependencies become way more difficult to manage. Because if we display this on a timeline, in reality, it of course looks more like this, right? And again, in knowledge work, many of these processes are not strictly linear anyway, and each box actually has multiple inputs and outputs because people there work on many different things at the same time, right? And the priorities of at least some of these things will inevitably conflict with each other. So there goes your predictability. I once supported a client where I had this little proof of concept project. It involved 13 different stakeholder groups. Most of them didn't actually do very much, but they needed to be included because otherwise someone might at the end disavow the whole effort, especially if it didn't work out well. Have you ever worked in an environment where pretty much every decision maker at every level has a calendar that is 90% full at all times? Yeah, that's what you get. Complex environment with full utilization. That proof of concept I mentioned took 6 months to complete, which was pretty good given that the client had actually been talking about this for like 3 years before I showed up. The thing is that I could have done the actual work in about 1 month if I didn't have to wait for other people for everything. So much for efficiency and speed to market. Also, if we look at this process, here's how much time is actually spent on work, right? And this is the amount of time just spent waiting. The ratio of work time over total time is known as process efficiency. If it takes you 2 to 3 weeks to schedule a 1-hour meeting, that's a process efficiency of about 1%, if I calculated that right. That's not so good. And then one more. Say the edict comes from above that each group has to make their part of the process 20% faster. That's a pretty aggressive target, right? That's not easy. So what is each silo manager going to focus on? The one thing they can see and control, right? The work time of their step. Now, if we actually succeed at cutting each of those by 20%, does that shorten the overall time by 20%? Depending on the process efficiency, we're likely to get less than half of that for the overall process. And part of the reason for that is who owns the wait time? The answer is nobody, really, right? So if you are a leader in a system like this, value stream mapping is very much your friend. And the more important speed and agility are, meaning really the more complex your system is, the more you need to reduce that friction stemming from excessive attempts at efficiency. And of course, this is where cross-functional teams are really helpful, right? That's one of the hallmarks of Agile. But again, the reality is often that the cross-functional team in this picture is step B, the Agile delivery team. And the other silos are still separated. Maybe because their vertical doesn't even connect with the other steps until like 3 levels up. The one thing we're observing here is what is called interconnectivity. As Snowden puts it, roughly, this is not an exact quote, in complex systems, the interaction between elements matters more than the individual elements themselves. Interestingly, Deming, who I did not really associate with complexity theory, personally, to be honest, says something very similar. Organizations will generally expect the value of this process we just looked at to be at least the sum of its parts, A plus B plus C. But what they actually get is the sum of the interactions between the different parts. And some of these interactions can be negative, right? Because if I make one of these steps more efficient and thus valuable, the result may be that the wait time from the previous step goes up. So due to the interaction, the total impact of that change could actually be negative. Now, Deming actually said this about people and their interactions, but it really applies to all kinds of agents or elements in a system, right? It is important with people too, though. I recently read an article in Talent Quarterly that was shared on LinkedIn that the way we select leaders systematically creates dysfunction at the top levels. And exactly no one is really surprised about that, right? But you might ask, why is that so? Even though I'm sure you all have plenty of answers from experience. But it turns out that the way most leadership development programs work is that they elevate individual top performers, which, to put it gently, is not always positively correlated with their abilities as team players. Right? So you end up getting this group of fantastic people who can't or don't necessarily want to collaborate well, meaning their interactions are actually creating negative value. Again, this is straight from that article by a bunch of leadership consultants. This Deming formula, these formulas here are of course pseudo-math, right? It's not real math. But fundamentally, what we're seeing here is the difference between additive and multiplicative systems. which one do you think is knowledge work? What about teams? Customer experience? All of these things are not about each individual step contributing some value. It is about the totality, the way these steps interact with each other. If you have a customer journey and there's some step in the middle where the experience is just absolutely horrible, that's going to impact the entire stream. And then, of course, the next question is whether efficiency is even the appropriate goal, right? Whenever I hear some executive wanting to introduce Agile as an efficiency play, I honestly gag just a little bit. Here's what General Stanley McChrystal has to say in Team of Teams. Or maybe it was really one of his co-authors, but they're not famous, so we don't care. Anyway, here goes. The pursuit of efficiency was once a laudable goal, but being effective in today's world is less a question of optimizing for a known and relatively stable set of variables than responsiveness to a constantly shifting environment. Adaptability, not efficiency, must become our central competency. Given that adaptive was the runner-up when the folks at Snowbird voted on a name for their manifesto, he might as well be talking directly about agility. And of course, his frame of reference is war. War tends to be very complex, which is why the military has for a long time been at the forefront of leading in complexity. Trent Hone, my colleague, could actually tell us a lot more about that. He's written one of the most well-respected recent books on that, actually. The problem is that without sufficient practice and sufficiently high stakes, even organizations that were good at this at some point get sort of ossified by bureaucracy over time and by a mindset that goes right back to focusing on predictability. And I mean, if we're really honest about it, in most organizations, the statement like, we should care less about efficiency is not a universal winner, right? Because we do need efficiency to be competitive. And it's true that agility comes with a bit of an efficiency penalty. So now what? Well, bounded applicability applies, right? This is more important in some settings than in others. One of the places at the macro level that we can look at for guidance is Kent Beck's 3X model. He apparently came up with this while he was working for Facebook, but I try not to hold that against him, only because he's also the guy who gets credit for extreme programming, meaning most of the technical practices in Agile, at least for Agile software. So he distinguishes 3 phases which sort of follow a product lifecycle. In Explore, you're just trying to figure out whether you're solving a problem that's even worth solving, whether anybody really cares. Complexity is usually very high here. Short feedback loops are the most important thing that you can worry about. In Expand, you know you got something good. You're just trying to ramp it up and work through the various impediments to scaling up as quickly as you can. Complexity can still be pretty high, even though some of the individual problems may actually be complicated. But you do need to be able to pivot quickly so you can throw your available capacity of whatever is most important right now. So agility is still very important. In Extract, did I mention he worked at Facebook? Right. Your goal is now to milk it for whatever you can. Efficiency is king, even though some of the customer-facing aspects are generally still complex because people in general just are. Now, depending on what you do, your work may be entirely in only one of these phases, or it may go back and forth. There are domains that are overwhelmingly Explore because everything is always a one-off. Manufacturing lines, on the other end, are almost entirely in Extract once they're set up. But an organization should always be conscientious of what they're dealing with instead of reflexively applying these efficiency-focused approaches from Extract to everything. All right, in Kinematic terms, don't get stuck in the confusion domain, right? And Agile actually helps us with differentiating our approach if we let it do that. Because bounded applicability also means that we may have to adjust our Agile approach based on what we're dealing with. So how does that work? Well, earlier we looked at how to decompose work in a plan-based approach. So let's look at how this should work in Agile. One key difference to this approach that I described earlier is that instead of going straight into the solution space, in Agile, we decompose our problem into smaller problems, sub-problems of the overall thing. And only once we have something that we think can be solved within 2 weeks or whatever, we define solutions for that. And some of these sub-problems will be complex, but others will be, complicated or even clear. Oh yeah, we've done this part a whole bunch of times before. We know how to do that. So the Agile idea of decomposing in the problem space and solutioning only for a small sub-problem at a time allows us to a much larger degree to isolate these domains and take advantage of keeping things simple and only making it harder when that's actually necessary. And then we can also prioritize the hard stuff for learning and maybe do some simpler things to show progress. And then by integrating these solutions back into our overall system, we can close that larger feedback loop and actively learn about whether we understood our problem correctly or maybe need to adjust a bit, right? In complex, even the target state is fuzzy. And if we allow ourselves to be a bit agile with our agile, we can take advantage of separating the domains where that's possible. So let me give you some examples. If one of the problems we need to solve is migrating an existing business calculation from an existing spreadsheet into a larger software app, and if we can architect that module to be sort of separate with a nicely defined interface contract, then we could waterfall that if we wanted to. There's very little complexity, very little chance of getting it wrong. We might as well spend the time to analyze the formulas, get those requirements signed off by the experts, and then build it. That could actually be more efficient. On the other hand, I recently worked with a team where we had a very important, entirely new piece of functionality with not a lot of detail in the business requirements. So while the rest of the team was doing the usual 2-week sprint, I met with one of the developers on a daily basis, and we did essentially 1-day sprints. It was insanely productive because I was able to see what he had done and give feedback all the time, and then go back to the end customer if that was necessary. And it often wasn't that he came with questions. It was the sort of daily sprint demo that surfaced these new adjustments in the next steps. Another example is I coached a very high-performing team a couple of years ago that is doing great with 3-week sprints. That sounds really long, but they work on a data science product with very low volatility, and most of their work is sort of under the hood and not visible to the end users anyway. So the feedback that they need comes mostly from within the team. Things like, what is the accuracy and the predictive power of the latest iteration of their model, or what's the data quality of this new source, things like that. And so they can afford to be a little bit more efficient by having less meetings across this time period, and it works well for them. And they also work very explicitly towards outcomes rather than just building widgets, and that's much harder to time box anyway. One other example, Gene Kim of the Phoenix Project fame has a beautiful slide that gives a great example. Again, this is from the software world, but he makes the case that in software, everything is exploration and very complex until you check in the code. And from there on forward, you want as little variance as possible. You need that predictability and repeatability to close that feedback loop quickly and with low risk. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that not all complexity is the same. There is this concept of emergence where the aggregate behavior of agents or elements in the system is distinct and unpredictable, even if we understand their individual behavior quite well. But something different happens when they all interact with each other. You could say that that's sort of real complexity. You're just sort of stuck with it. You can't just take it apart because it behaves entirely differently at different scales. On the other hand, there's also what we could call reducible complexity. I'm not sure that's really an official term. I kind of made that up. But in that case, things behave like a complex system, but it's sort of a little bit fake, even though it feels like it. But because we can actually change that behavior, at least to some degree. What I just talked about in that decomposition slide is a version of that, right? Where we identify separate subproblems that fall into the different domains. So you could call that domain-aware decomposition if you want. Because some of these subproblems will move to a different domain if we separate them properly. Another approach is quite simply learning. Right? Physics is a good example. As we humans have probed and sensed and responded over the millennia, mostly by probing again in different ways, we have sort of teased out increasingly more sophisticated rules, and now we can harness even the really weird stuff like quantum physics and build entirely new computing devices based on that. And similar things, often happen when organizations introduce new technology, right? There's lots of stuff like that happening with AI right now, where people are doing all kinds of learning and figuring out the rules of how to make good use of that. Liz Keogh has suggested a simple but pretty nifty scale to kind of get to that a little bit. You just ask your teams to rate appropriate units of work against this scale here, right? From everybody in the world knows how to do this to nobody has ever done this before. And if your team comes back with any 4s or 5s, you should probably consider working as if you are in complexity, even if after a while you figure it out and it becomes more predictable. Another very helpful approach in that realm is to set what is called enabling constraints. By creating guardrails through number of constraints and assumptions, what we do is we limit the available options, which allows us to treat things as more predictable. And we do this all the time in life. The key is to be aware that we're doing that and not forget that we are artificially limiting this complex behavior, which means we may not see the full impact of unexpected responses until it's kind of too late. Now, that was a mouthful of a sentence. So let's look at an example. Going back to sort of classic Agile, when we select a sprint backlog, the stuff we're going to work on for the next week or a couple of weeks or whatever, we do usually select a small subset of a complex problem. And the same holds true if we're pulling a Kanban ticket or whatever way it is that we're kind of chopping our work down into smaller pieces. So we then agree on a set of assumptions and constraints. This is the most important thing that we can work on right now until we're done. This is what a successful solution looks like. We limit the scope of what we consider as well as the inputs, and then we design a solution for that. And by doing that, what happens is that we create a sort of temporary and somewhat artificial sphere of certainty that essentially moves a small part of our overall problem over here into the more predictable space where it's much easier to resolve and we can be more productive. And then when we're done, the key is that we immediately integrate it back into the overall system. We essentially launch a new probe and see how the system reacts to that. So sprint or Kanban commitments give us this sort of ongoing dance between the complex domain where the reality of our problem lives and the predictable area where we're actually much better at getting stuff done. And again, the idea is that, if you make assumptions around how to solve a particular smaller aspect of something, that's good, that's very helpful, but just be aware that it is artificial to some degree. So you really need to see what happens with the overall system by sort of integrating things back in. And sometimes we can move things between domains if we are able to actually just change the constraints of the entire system, right? Most of these systems are open. To me, deployments are a great example of that. The research, for those of you who follow these kinds of things, the DORA metrics, the State of DevOps report, there's a set of metrics that positions the ability to do deployments well as an indicator of overall delivery excellence. But traditionally, and in many organizations to this day, deployments are kind of a nightmare of complexity, right? There's always the possibility of unexpected outcomes. Often we get this close to dropping into chaos. And this complexity is very much driven by constraints in a lot of ways, right? There's technical and cost constraints that result in non-standardized environments. Everything is different. There are organizational constraints that we already talked about, where different groups own different aspects and they aren't aligned. Capability constraints, where not everybody has the same level of relevant knowledge. But then things like virtualization and DevOps and cloud and infrastructure as code and automated pipelines changed a lot of these constraints and to a large degree removed the human element, which is always complex. And once all that is in place, we end up with a system that has practically perfect repeatability, right? Push button deployments 1,000 times a day if needed. Check in the code, there's a single best way of deploying it. We have moved this whole problem to domain. Now, building all of that is not necessarily a trivial problem, but even that is getting more and more commoditized. So in many ways, you can look at infrastructure as code as a domain transition. And the same is really true anytime you can automate something that used to involve a lot of human interaction, because we always introduce complexity. However, we do have to be very careful with that, because this brings us to perhaps the most interesting domain transition in the Kinematic framework, the one between the clear domain and the chaotic. Maybe you've been wondering what that little squiggle there is at the bottom. This is what's called the Cliff of Complacency. Basically, if we are dealing with a complex problem, but we apply very simple and prescriptive solutions like standard operating procedures or an automated process or a fixed master plan that, overly constrains the way we can respond, then if there's any sort of unanticipated change that we didn't see coming in either the problem or the context that we operate in, then what can happen is that our prescribed solution just no longer works because there's no room to adjust. And if that gap ends up resulting in an emergency, then we've essentially fallen over the cliff and have a dumpster fire to deal with, or a plane crash. Because you could argue that these two Boeing 737 MAX plane crashes a couple of years ago can essentially be traced back to over-constraining a complex problem. Now, this is all based on news articles, but from what I've read, Boeing made a decision to insert an automated control override to make up for a design change to their engines. Why is sort of a messy mix of financial and regulatory reasons, but however that went, unfortunately, when they wrote the software, they did not account for a sensor malfunction that resulted in an unexpected system state. There were no specific programmed rules for what to do in that case, and so some random inappropriate code executed, and the planes crashed because of that, because they had taken away the pilot's ability to counteract. If you automate something that is so critical, you better make sure you really understand all the possible system inputs. Now, this is a very morbid and very sad story, but to be honest, that's kind of the point, right? This stuff is not just theory. It really, really matters. There are real life consequences to this. A bit less dramatic, but maybe closer to home for many of you. Until recently, I supported the Office of the Inspector General for Health and Human Services here, and those folks do some really, really awesome work. One example of that is the report they created about the launch of healthcare.gov. Now, those of you who live in the US are probably like, oh yeah, I know where this is going. Here's what happened. It was a complex problem with lots of uncertainty, huge system for people to sign up for health insurance, right? Complex problem, lots of uncertainty, but the people in charge defaulted to what they knew. So it was managed as a traditional complicated project with an enormous long-term plan. Of course, reality started to diverge from the plan. Nobody wanted to hear the bad news. At some point, it was too late. The site goes live because fixed deadline. Instantly crashes under the load. Nobody could actually sign up. Boom. Fairly big dumpster they fired up there. Now, I'm sort of curious, if you think about that, does that sound familiar, right? Has anybody worked on a large project like this or maybe witnessed one? And the answer is probably yes, because that desire to treat things as predictable is just, it's always there. And if you couple it with the lack of understanding of different ways of doing this, then the temptation to engage in what is essentially wishful thinking is pretty big, and it happens a lot. And that brings us to the last distinction between, let me see. Let me look at time. You know what? I'm going to reserve time for Q&A. So we're going to skip the breakout, and I'm just going to go through the rest of the slides, and then we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A. All right. So that brings us to the last distinction between sort of predictable and unpredictable, right? Our approach to risk management. In the predictable space, we can come up with what we can call fail-safe procedures. If you follow these steps, nothing should go wrong. For complex problems, on the other hand, unexpected outcomes, including some that we will not like, are pretty much unavoidable. Bad things don't always happen necessarily, but we can't guarantee that we can prevent them. So we have to work in a way that makes it safe for us to fail at some of our efforts. Which sounds a bit scary, right? Because failing is not something that we particularly enjoy. But at the same time, we all know that it's the truth. No matter how much effort and caution you invest, stuff still goes wrong. So let's take a quick look at some risk mitigation approaches in the different domains. In the clear domain, we have done very well with things like checklists if we have human operators, or if we are really sure we understand the problem very well, we can and probably really should automate things. In the complicated domain, we can do things like expert reviews. In complex, obviously things get a little bit more interesting. One of the first things to do is, front load the learning, because as we discussed, sometimes we are actually able to find some rules, or at least good heuristics, and that allows us to move things into complicated. And even then, it's generally still helpful to set up a bunch of automated monitoring so that if anything goes wrong, we actually catch that as quickly as possible, preferably before it does any damage. On the people side, the military employs an approach called red teaming, where a group of friendly collaborators plays the role of the adversary. The idea is to have someone very systematically play devil's advocate, right? To argue against things so that we can surface assumptions and challenge groupthink. And by making that official, people are empowered to be the critics, to be the negative ones. And in general, empowering the people who do the actual work is maybe one of the most important risk mitigation strategies. And then finally, in chaotic, the risks have already happened, so what's left is decisive action to just try to stabilize it. Now, in order for people to be empowered, they kind of need three things at least, right? First, they need context. This relates to ideas like starting with why, outcomes over outputs, mission objectives, decision filters like, will this action increase customer happiness or not? The second thing is that people need is to have some bandwidth available. There is a great paper by Richard Cook called How Complex Systems Fail. And one of the key insights in there is that, as he puts it, human operators have dual roles as both the producers of value and as defenders against failure. So if we impose too much work in progress and focus on utilization, we essentially take away people's ability. Of course, if once something bad happens, if it's bad enough, then there's usually this sharp pivot towards safety and security, which generally includes a lot of new rules and even more theater, if we're honest. But as the pain fades, most organizations go right back to pushing for more productivity. So if you are a leader in a complex environment, cut your people some slack. Like literally, give them some space to think and stay alert to their environment. And not just when it's convenient because we have some downtime. This is much harder said than done, but it's really, really important. And then finally, people have to feel safe enough, right, to flag problems if they see them. As the story goes, back in the day, workers at Toyota pulled the famous Anden cord, the signal to stop the entire line because of some problem, 1,000 times per shift. When American car companies attempted to copy the entire Toyota system, almost nobody pulled the cords. Why? Because everybody knew that stopping the line was very expensive, and when someone pulled it without a reason that management found sufficient, they were in trouble. So people just didn't take that risk. This here is a quote by Amy Edmondson. She's a professor at Harvard Business School and probably best known for her work on psychological safety. And what really resonated with me about this is that what we ask people to do when we introduce agility practices, transparency, divergent opinions, constant check-ins, tolerance for failure, is not exactly very natural behavior for most people. And so as leaders, it is really important that we not only create an environment that makes this possible, but that we constantly need to nourish these things, including by modeling them to those around us, right? You can't work successfully in the complex domain without constant effort to maintain the approach. There are entire presentations on psychological safety, so I'm not going to try to replicate that here, but here's just a short list of things that you might want to consider. In complex problems, we can't predict what exactly will happen, but patterns, heuristics, all that are still useful in helping us anticipate what could happen. And so we want to encourage different perspectives, right? If people disagree, we want to know, what are they seeing that we don't? Also, we kind of tend to reward people for showing a lot of confidence, for having answers and making bold projections. But the reality is that in complex problems, we don't ever fully know. And it's actually dangerous to assume we do, because it makes us blind to the possibility that unexpected things are actually fairly likely to happen. And so we need to make space in our culture for not knowing, and instead ask, what can we do to learn more, to reduce the uncertainty? You probably want to do the hard stuff early and front load the learning, because while doing the easy stuff looks like you're making much faster progress, you're really just pushing the risk to the end. And when it comes to learning, imperfection is your friend, because perfection tends to be expensive. And then finally, and this is, especially the higher up we go, the more people are like, oh, this needs to be this perfect glossy thing before I can show it to an executive to get their feedback. And the reality is that's probably not true. Show them the sketch. They can give you the exact same feedback on that, unless it's about the design. And finally, really important, we need to create a culture where it is encouraged and actually required to share bad news. So it's hard to bring all of this down into a few takeaways, but I'm going to try. Complexity, whether it's real or sort of pseudo complexity, makes most problems behave unpredictably. That is true for anything sufficiently large in scope that hasn't been done before, at least by us, that involves a lot of different inputs and interactions, especially if some of them come from humans, and that's subject to frequent learning and change. Agile can help us manage these complex, unpredictable efforts. Most aspects of Agile, like cross-functional teams, intense collaboration, frequent reviews, working in small chunks. They're all geared towards making this reality visible and being able to adjust. Utilization, that push for efficiency, often conflicts with agility. Utilization almost always does. Efficiency, if you do it really, really well and context specific, then it doesn't have to interfere, but often it does as well. So we kind of want to be careful. What is our main goal? Is it to be as efficient as possible because we're in extract where we just need to, we know exactly what we're doing. We just need to make it as cost effective as possible. Or are we in something new where we're exploring? And then finally, psychological safety is key to all of this because we want to encourage different opinions, bad news, imperfection, learning over knowing. Those are all necessary to thrive in the absence of predictability. And that is the end of the presentation. So we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. I'm going to stay on for a little bit longer anyway, if there's more conversation. And let's open the mics. Any questions? I haven't looked at the chat really because, well, I'm presenting. Are there any questions in there, or does anybody have any questions?
Mathias, thank you so much. We'll open up the chat is available, but also come off mute, add your video, just to make it more interactive, and that would be great.
Yes.
So far, we don't have questions in the chat.
All right. There's got to be something. It's a lot of stuff. So.
It's a lot to think about. And Matt, maybe can we unmute everyone? Is that too scary?
No, it's fine. If you have a question, just feel free to come off mute yourself or turn your video on. It's up to, feel free to do what you feel most comfortable.
One of my favorite tips in Zoom is if you are in Zoom and you're on mute, you can just simply hit the space bar and that will temporarily unmute you. So if you're trying to figure out things.
So Leslie says she has a question, but she can't unmute. I don't know. I'm a host.
I will take care of that. 1 second.
Okay. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
So many things that are different as host. So how to deal with leaders who do not recognize this stuff and continue to demand exact time frames. Yeah, that is a huge one, right? Hopefully by having more of a conceptual understanding of this and having some of the vocabulary around it, you will be able to actually start having conversations about this. I mean, if it's too many levels up, then it's a little more difficult. But most people really don't even know how to talk about this, and they don't even know that these different areas exist. So often I kind of walk people through a very basic version of this, just the ideas. I don't even mention that this is Kinematic or anything. I just kind of walk them through these ideas, and that can help a little bit. And then the other tactic that can work is find areas where predictability does not hold up in their sphere of experience, things that they can relate to, and then challenge them on how good their predictions are in that space. And once you can sort of convince people that the things where they think that predictability is ridiculous, like football games, that's actually very similar to what you're dealing with, you can at least start making inroads. I mean, no organization is ever going to switch over from fully predictable to this kind of stuff like in a moment. That's what entire transformations are about. But you can at least start having conversations of what is our goal here. You can also talk about, like the Kent Beck, the 3X model, talking about where are we and what is important to us right now. Is it focused on like really being, pulling the maximum, getting the best resource intensity, getting the best ROI? Or are we not even sure that we're building the right thing, that somebody actually wants this? Does that help a little bit? I mean, it's not an easy answer. There is no easy answer, but those are all kind of ways in which you can start having these conversations at least.
Well, it helps a little bit, but it's still difficult. First, accessibility, I should say, is a big issue. Even as a consultant, sometimes it's not easy to have this kind of discussions with leaders because they have their own, mindset, which is, as you said earlier, typically it says, I give it this much of money, you need to give me this and this by that time for that number of people. Or tell me how many people for how much time. and how much money you want, and then to give me what I want. And they are usually, in my experience, not usually, but often not open to discuss other options or other ways of doing things.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. None of this is easy. The cultural predispositions are overwhelmingly towards complicated. So it is like you have to build momentum for it, and the best thing that I can point to is probably why we start with introducing pilot teams. Usually, if you can start showing some successes, that can help. I also very often point to the example of Amazon. I believe that Amazon is basically destroying every single market that they enter because they do this. They understand that failure is normal. They understand that you're going to have to iterate on stuff. They understand that out of 10 things that they launch, 9 will probably fail. The best organizations in the industry and the best organizations in the world follow these approaches. So, but how you get people around really depends on the individual person, and it's definitely not easy. So, do we have any other? There's plenty of other questions coming in now.
Yes. So let's just read the next one. Sorry, I seem to have lost it, but
do we want to? I think Leslie was one of the first ones. Can you unmute yourself at this point, Leslie? Sorry.
Sure.
Just wanted to make sure we had this.
Yeah, thank you. I also put it in the chat. So it's basically, it's related to what you're just talking about. But I know a lot of leadership, they really like to refer to change management, maybe because it's a little bit less risky is if they have the process. So I was wondering, would you be able to share some change management references for us? And then that might help us have a frame of reference to build on when we're having these conversations with them.
Yeah, I mean, there's lean change management. I'm forgetting the name of the author at this point, but there's definitely someone who focuses a lot on this sort of and he's using lean in the sense of lean startup, not in the sense of lean manufacturing. So that word is a little bit loaded, but that's a good place to go and get some ideas. The idea again is that you have to be very adaptive, that you can't make one big change management plan. I'd say starting with why in this case really is important. You do need to give people a reason, and it doesn't just it can't just be the company reason, right? One of the things that in my opinion is most often overlooked in change management is the WIFM. What's in it for me? Because if you're not giving me a reason why this is good or at least not bad and scary for me, then I'm not playing along, right? And so, I mean, that's one of the reasons why so much of this is really hard, because for a lot of the people in the middle, the first thing they hear is that we're taking away your control, right? The people that you quote own, we're taking away your budgets, we're taking away your line of command. So you really have to show them a vision and of why this also benefits them in some way. That vision might just be our company will not go bankrupt and you will not lose your job in 2 years, because if we don't do anything, that's what's going to happen. Or you might have to start looking at incentives. I mean, that's one of the big problems that all of these in complex systems, the relationship between so many inputs is what matters. So if we don't talk to HR, if we don't talk about who gets promoted, who gets paid based on what, it's really hard to convince people to change their individual behavior if they're still anchored to their bonus and to their promotion path that's based on well, I need to make my numbers. Frankly, screw the people down the pipe, right? That doesn't I feel for them, but that doesn't help me. So value stream mapping, you do need some top coverage. Value stream mapping, where you start identifying the overall flow of things through the system and tie your metrics to what happens at the end, the overall outcomes, not the individual breakdowns. Without that, you're kind of working on goodwill. And even if people want this, it's a little bit exhausting, and if all the rest of the system pulls them back towards the other stuff, it's not going to fly. So I think the biggest thing is your change management has to be comprehensive, it has to be adaptive, and you really need to focus on why should people at the individual level support this. Does that help?
Okay. Yeah, that was excellent. Thank you so much.
Cool. Thanks. Any other questions? We are. Yeah, go ahead.
I would say Renuka was next in our questions. So Renuka, if you can come off mute and just ask, that would be great.
And I realize we are at time, so if any of you need to drop off, thank you so much for joining us today. I will stay on until we run out of questions. I don't have any other meetings planned, but thank you so much for joining us. If you have any feedback, please leave it in the chat. Great to have you all. So I think Ranuka was the person with the question.
Yes, I just put that question in the chat. Leaders think of their psychological safety, so that prevents them from intervening to the other psychological safety. So, what's your
thought? That's a tough one. I would argue that being a leader, what qualifies you as being a leader is that you don't just think about your own stuff, that you actually take some responsibility for the people who work for you. Now, again, that depends on how you got to be a leader. How do we answer that? I mean, demonstrating that the health and welfare of the team is helpful for them as well. You know, maybe like, is there ways you can align interests? If say something bad happens, can we talk to the leader about how, if people had felt more incentivized and more empowered to point that out, then this bad thing that maybe now reflected badly on the leader would have maybe not happened. I mean, there's obviously plenty of books. There's David Marquette, you know, Turn the Ship Around. There's all kinds of examples where people kind of demonstrate that. But again, to me, it kind of comes down to how can I show that leader that it is actually in their best interest to have people who tell them the truth, to have people who are, you know, who have the bandwidth to pay attention to stuff. And sometimes it's, you know, taking examples like, you know, the Experian hack or just bad things that happened in other places where people didn't pay attention to this kind of stuff. You know, Wells Fargo, there's so many examples out there. It kind of scare them a little bit. I mean, it's not the best way to motivate people, but sometimes if people really only care about their own outcomes, you kind of have to give them the big fat, like, this could happen to you if you don't, you know, not the preferred approach, but whatever it takes.
I mean, this happens mostly in the middle management. Even if the top management tries to do, the middle management are bound with top end.
Yeah. And then, I mean, sometimes depending on how accessible your top management is, you know, you want to be careful when you go behind, like, over people's heads and stuff like that. But, you know, some organizations do things like open space. I mean, that's pretty advanced, but like my boss 2 levels up, for example, has the ability that everybody can schedule a 15-minute meeting with him if they want to. And then you can have conversations. You don't want to like bad talk your boss, but you can talk about like, hey, I'm kind of observing this and this happening. It might be helpful if you from the top down set an expectation that we create space for that or something. I mean, you know, like, none of these answers are easy. I know none of this stuff I talk about is like, here, do this, because if I did that, I would be a safe consultant. Sorry, that was a bad kind of step. But you know what I'm getting, right? We're not selling pre-configured solutions. Everything has to be tailored to your context. And frankly, none of it is really easy.
Thank you.
Didn't mean to, you know, insult any safe consultants if we have them. Safe can be great if you do it right.
No, it's really good, Mathias, and I think that covers the questions we've had in the chat. And so I really want to thank you. I think your takeaways really helped with kind of consolidating the look back on this. But a couple things that I noticed or that were really helpful to me was how you tied Agile to the complex domain and really focused on iterate and learn. I love the concept of adaptability versus efficiency or even change management, in that change is constant. So this ability of an individual, a team, an organization to adapt through these cycles, I think was really crucial and helpful. And I think if we shift our language from change to adapt, that will really help organizations and our people not really be so scared about it. It's not a one-time event. It's happening all the time. So how do we navigate it? And then a third thing you did is this concept of, there are a ton of models and you went through some really great ones, but the thing that kept coming out for me, Mathias, is the fact that you have to know where you're at before you can apply a model. And that critical element, I think, is something that people skip a lot, or organizations skip a lot. So I really appreciated how you focused in on that, and appreciate your taking the time today. Again, these sessions were no cost, and Mathias, you helped us all learn and grow today, and we really appreciate your commitment.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Great points that you pulled out, all of them really important. I'm glad that came through. And again, thanks everybody for joining us today. I hope you got something interesting out of it, a few things to take away, some conversations to be had. Again, contact me if you want to, reach out on LinkedIn, send me an email, tweet at me if you want. I'm happy to talk about this stuff. I love this. This is, to me, very, very important as an Agile practitioner. So thanks so much for having me, and have a great rest of your day. And thanks for sharing your time with us. And thanks to Denise and Matt and everybody and Trent for helping out and making this possible. So thanks.
All right. Have a great rest of the day.
Bye, everyone.